All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to your Alumni Association's Town Hall. I am Dr. Jenn Wells. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a proud alum of the class of 2007 and an even prouder member of the board of directors for the UCLA Alumni Association. UCLA Alumni Town Halls are gathering places where Bruins can have their voices heard, ask essential questions, and receive transparency and expertise. This evening, it is a great pleasure to be speaking with our amazing guest, Dr. Darnell Hunt, who serves as a professor in the Department of African American Studies and the Department of Sociology, and is the Dean of Social Sciences. Dean Hunt is a double Bruin, class of 91 and Ph.D. in 94. He is the lead author of the Hollywood Diversity Report, an annual series that examines the relationship between diversity and profit in the entertainment industry. It is our pleasure to welcome him this evening. Good evening, Dean Hunt.
Oh, great to be here, Jen.
Yeah. So do you want to start us off by just telling us about yourself and your role at UCLA?
Sure. So this is my 5th year as Dean of the Division of Social Sciences at UCLA, which is our largest division. We have about close to 10,000 students, believe it or not, about 300 faculty members, 18 different academic departments and programs, and about 10 or so research centers in the Division of Social Sciences. So we do everything from archaeology, anthropology, through sociology, history. We have the ethnic studies departments like African American Studies, Asian American Studies, Chicano, American Indian. We have economics, we have geography. It's a very broad division. I like to think of it as a microcosm of the campus as a whole.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so do you want to talk to us a little bit, introduce the Hollywood Diversity Report and tell us about your work on it?
Sure. So the Hollywood Diversity Report is a report that we've been doing at UCLA since 2014. That was when the initial report came out. At that time, it was an annual report, and the goal of the report was to kind of fill a gap in what we know about diversity in front of and behind the camera in Hollywood. Prior to our report, there was a lot of anecdotal evidence about diversity in Hollywood, but no one had really done a definitive, comprehensive study, which is very data heavy and data rich, that different entities in the industry could use to sort of gauge how they were doing, on various aspects of sort of production in the industry. So starting around 2012 or so, we went on a listening tour. We visited all the major studios, networks, employment guilds. We met with different advocacy groups to get a sense of what people would like to see in an industry-wide report. And the way we thought of this was, UCLA is a public institution, and we have a public mission to serve the state of California, to serve the greater good. And we kind of saw this report as doing our public service, providing data free of charge to the industry to hopefully help it do a better job in terms of being more inclusive for women and people of color in front of the camera and behind the camera. So that's kind of how the report started. I could go much further back in terms of how I personally got involved in this, but that's kind of how it started at UCLA. And since we released our first report in 2014, which at that point was annual, the report gained a lot of steam. It gained a lot of publicity, visibility. It gets covered in most of the major industry news outlets, popular news outlets. We do a lot of media around the report when it comes out. Eventually, the report grew to the point where we released it twice a year. And what we did was we tied the release of the report to major landmark, events in the industry. And so for film, it's Oscars. The report comes out during Oscars week, right before the telecast. So typically the telecast is on a Sunday. We release the report on a Wednesday or a Thursday. And then the TV report typically comes out the week of Emmys. And, because of the pandemic, these dates have been moving around. But typically Oscars are sometime in late winter, early spring, and Emmys tend to be in the fall. And so we release the report now twice a year. We release a TV specific report and a film specific report.
Great. That's so wonderful to hear about kind of the timing of that and what impact that probably makes with that timing. You mentioned a little bit about kind of the historical anecdotal data. Can you share about where the data comes from for this report? I know I'm imagining some folks want to know if students are involved in that process or
Right. So this is a great opportunity for our students. I mean, our students are the really heavy lifters for this report, and it is a year-long process. We are never not working on the report. I mean, so there's students right now, as I'm talking, working on this report, because there's lots and lots of data that goes into putting the report together every year. So we create our own database. It starts in Excel. Imagine this huge Excel spreadsheet with, I don't know, 100,000 cells, you know, 1,000 or so rows, with all the different TV shows and movie titles, and the columns would be maybe 100 or so variables we look at for each TV show or movie. Essentially what we do is we go to other databases and we selectively pull information from them. We process the information and put it into our own proprietary database that we use to then run analysis in a statistical package that we have. So the types of things we look at are, director, the race and gender of the director of a film or a TV show, the creator of a TV show. We look at writers, we look at the top 8 actors in order of credit. And so credits become very important. The way that talent is credited is almost like currency in Hollywood. So it's very reliable, because your career depends upon your credit. So we have a high degree of confidence in our data that it's complete in that sense. So we collect data for every person associated with these film and TV projects, the major people in front of and behind the camera, the actors, the writers, directors, producers, etc. All this information, as we pull it from other databases, and in some cases, literally Googling people, because we may find their name in a database, but we don't know about their gender, or we don't know about their race or ethnicity. Just to kind of give you an example, it's not uncommon for women in the Hollywood industry not to identify their gender because of gender bias in the industry. And people who haven't developed a reputation yet, who don't want to be passed over for certain opportunities, will often use their first initial in their last name and use their credit. Wow. So that's something that we have to research, to figure out, in some cases, who the person is with respect to these categories. And it's only by having this information that we can look at trends over time to see if, in fact, there do appear to be, trends that are troubling with respect to bias, either for gender or race, ethnicity, that type of thing. And so we've been tracking data now for almost 10 years. And I think we have probably the biggest set of data that's ever existed to kind of look at these questions and to be able to speak to whether or not there's actually been progress, or whether people's perceptions of progress are in fact not valid. So that's kind of the purpose of the report, the way it's coordinated, and I guess how we use it.
Given what you talked about in terms of that progress over those 10 years, what are some of the biggest changes or highlights that you want to share with our community tonight?
So when we started this report, there was a lot of, I guess, moral pressure put on the industry to be more inclusive. People felt it was the right thing to do, that, Hollywood plays a major cultural role in our society by producing movies and TV shows that depict what American life is like, who's included, who's not. And to the extent that certain groups are marginalized or invisible altogether, it's almost like symbolic annihilation. They're not sort of part of the national tapestry, the story of America. And that, I'm a sociologist by training, by the way, that can have an impact on how people view one another. If a lot of what you think you know about people is what you see through media, those images start to shape your view of reality and the way you might respond to people, whether or not you perceive them as a threat or as a friend or someone who's similar to you, etc. So, Hollywood is entertaining, but it's more than just entertainment. It actually does shape the frames that we use to make sense of the reality around us. So starting with that premise, there have been lots of advocacy groups like the NAACP, for example, from their very beginning in the early 20th century, they were really concerned with early Hollywood films that depicted African Americans as not suitable for citizenship or less than full people at the very time that, the group was pressing towards a more, inclusive, integrated society. The same is true for other racial and ethnic groups. The National Hispanic Media Coalition has been very concerned about the way that people of Latin descent are depicted in films and TV shows. There are a number of advocacy groups focusing on women and depiction of women and the way they've been either included or not included.
Right.
So as you might imagine, any group that is marginalized in any particular way in America, Americans with disabilities, there are lots of different groups that are very concerned, LGBTQ groups, about the way they're depicted in media.
Yeah.
So our study doesn't get so much into the images and sort of the stories. It's more focused on who's doing the work, because that obviously has an impact on the stories that are told. Right. And if you have writers' rooms in TV, where the scripts are written and the stories developed that exclude women or people of color from that process, even if you're telling stories about women and people of color, those stories are not going to ring true, or they're not going to be plausible, or they might be more likely to incorporate stereotypes than if the stories involve people who actually have experience with those communities. So part of the argument for making Hollywood more inclusive is not only to tell stories that are more reflective of our reality, but to tell them in a way that's more empowering and more affirming, So anyway, so that's kind of the why do we do this part of the story. Right. But what did we find? Well, we found that when we first started doing this, there was a lot of pressure put on the industry to do the right thing. But the industry, of course, is a business. I mean, they don't call it show business for nothing. And it's about making money. And I think the prevailing wisdom among many Hollywood executives at the time was that, it would be great, if we could do this. But the bottom line is, this is what sells. And diversity is not a high priority for us right now because, we're making these blockbuster films and these films that we sell and market overseas. And we just don't see any great urgency to kind of diversify because that's not, increasing the amount of money we bring in. And at the end of the day, that's what we're really focused on. So to the extent that the industry paid sort of attention to some of these pressures, it was more like lip service. So they would, symbolically, we'll do a little this, a little that, but it wasn't a major priority. It wasn't like at the top of the list of things that the industry was focused on. And so it was somewhat difficult for our report to gain traction initially. We had to convince people on why the report was important. I mean, the advocacy groups got it because they wanted us to make the case. But the industry itself was like, okay, well, it's UCLA. We'll listen to them and see what they have going on. But we're not completely, optimistic about this making all that big of a difference. But we'll play along. That was kind of the approach. But over time, as the report started to gain traction, we were really intent on trying to see if we could make a connection between diversity on screen and the bottom line. That is to say, what people decide to watch. Because one of the things that as a sociologist, I'm acutely aware of, and as sociologists we study, is demographic change in American society. And our society is becoming more and more diverse. In fact, as of 2021, the US population was about 42.7% people of color. And that's pretty significant, and that number is increasing, as we move closer to a majority minority type of society. In California, we already are majority minority, and we've been that way for a couple of decades now. So one of the things we wanted to look at was, well, as society becomes more diverse, do viewing habits change, which has an impact, which could have an impact on the bottom line. That is to say, people who are more diverse might want to see their stories told. They might want to see people on the screen who look like them, who they can identify with, and maybe they gravitate toward those projects. So we started tracking that. We started looking at the relationship between the two, and lo and behold, what we found in our very first study was a pretty compelling finding that looked like, TV shows and movies that were more reflective of American diversity, all things equal, when you control for all these other factors, appeared to do a little bit better. And what we found every year since then is an increasing relationship between those two factors. And as America has become more diverse. So somewhere around year 3, the industry started getting the memo, and they were like, wow, this is pretty compelling. And I think, we don't want to take credit for just changing the way the industry thinks, but clearly there's been a discourse shift in the industry away from this idea that, diversity is a luxury and something that just kind of, we have to pay attention to it, but it's not our priority, to today where it is like, a first order business imperative. Like, you'd be hard pressed to find any industry studio or network that's not talking about diversity right up front in terms of everything they do, because it makes them huge bucks. In fact, there was a study done by Kinsey & Company, I believe 2 years ago, that showed that the industry was leaving literally billions of dollars on the table by not diversifying its content for the diverse groups that are growing in American society. And that was very consistent with kind of the logic of what our reports have been showing for the last 10 years.
Yeah. I really appreciate, so in my day job, I work at a girls' school, and I do diversity and equity and inclusion work. And I really appreciate what you're tying the relationship between diversity and inclusion, right? Like, inclusion almost can't happen in the fullest way if we don't have folks who from different backgrounds were represented creating those stories. So I really appreciate that. Along those lines, and in my work, I often am doing definitions and language use to make sure that we're all on the same page and talking about very similar things. Could you share a little bit about what language, like how did you grapple with language throughout the report, and how that influences how you write the report?
Yeah. Diversity is it's a word that has been used for a number of years now, and there are some people who want to move away from the use of the term diversity because they feel that it doesn't adequately capture the totality of what we're talking about here. And so, for example, it's very common now in the industry and in higher education to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the relationship between the three. Diversity alone is not enough because, you're just talking about a certain type of mix, but what is the impact of that mix, in terms of the quality of life and the experiences that people have. I think we chose diversity quite deliberately when we first conceived of the report, because the situation was so unknown at the time, and most of the anecdotes suggested that, particularly behind the camera, there just wasn't a lot of diversity. So we wanted to kind of zero in on that piece because we could measure it in ways that are harder to do if you're talking about equity and inclusion, which brings in other dimensions of the problem. So our report principally is a numbers and accounting exercise, and it is just looking primarily at who's in the room, who's in the job, and trying to relate that to other things, like I said, like the bottom line. We haven't focused so much on the inclusion and the equity part. The equity part, of course, would go to things like salary differentials, and it would do more in terms of sort of the power and the influence that people have in their different positions. Some of that is kind of known from the job titles, and we do look at some of that.
Okay.
And certainly the inclusion piece talks about the climate in the workplace and things like that, which we can't really examine with our data. But there is a literature on this stuff, and we do know that there's a relationship between the types of numbers we generate in terms of diversity and some of these other dimensions that are there. So we kind of see our report as sort of complementing the work of people who are doing more focused work on the inclusion and equity front. And it's not a report that tries to do everything. It's very focused on what it does. And because our goal has been to track data over time and look at trends, we've been rigidly, consistent in terms of how we measure things and how we do it, so that we're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges over time, to be able to say definitively, yes, there's been progress or there hasn't been progress.
Absolutely. And I think related, I know that there's been criticism for kind of what does it mean to include LGBTQ identities or even disability, like folks with disabilities. Can you talk a little bit about that criticism and how you respond to it?
Sure. So when we started our report back in 2014, there was a very vocal movement among racial and ethnic minorities and women, specifically, with respect to diversity in Hollywood and the degree to which people from those groups were present in front of and behind the camera. And that's kind of where we sort of planted our flag when we first designed our study. Since then, there have been movements, and I shouldn't say since then. I mean, there's always been movements of other groups to be more inclusive. And I guess what I'm saying is that those other groups had the loudest, sort of voices at that point in terms of access to the bully pulpit and so forth and so on, to really draw attention to the under inclusion of women and people of color and so forth. And so that's what our report initially focused on. As we move forward, and it became clear how important these things are to the way groups are represented, other groups who have been marginalized in society, such as LGBTQ groups, people with disabilities, etc. The problem that we faced, with respect to our report and the design of our report, is that the data on which our report rests is widely available with respect to race and gender, race, ethnicity, and gender, but there are almost no data comparable to what we use for some of these other categories and these other marginalized groups. So what we're wrestling with right now, what we've been doing, I think, most recently is noting, even though we use diversity in our title, that, we're using it in a very limited way to talk about race and ethnicity and gender. And unfortunately, we just don't have the data to be able to talk about some of these other marginalized groups in a comprehensive and objective way. And that is the cornerstone of our report, to be comprehensive and objective. It really is as inclusive as you can get in terms of the data. And so that's one of the reasons why I think the industry has relied upon our report so much. The other thing that we've thought about is possibly changing the name of our report and specifying in the title that it really does focus on race and gender as opposed to those other categories, while we're waiting for solutions to how we might study something like LGBTQ status when many people don't publicly acknowledge what their identity is in that respect, or even people with disabilities, some of which are more visible and some aren't. Sometimes there's privacy issues around certain types of disabilities. And so how do you have a comprehensive, accurate accounting of that in the same way that you can with gender and gender and race ethnicity? Now, I will say that in recent years, with respect to gender, we've started including other genders like trans and bi, and again, it's somewhat limited by people who choose to identify that way, and we do have data and we do count for people who do identify, but that's been I think more reliable than sort of those other areas that we still have a hard time with. So I think going forward, the practice for us has been to qualify what we mean by diversity and to kind of present our report as one that complements reports and studies that look at those other groups as well.
Thank you. I know that you also mentioned kind of your work with advocacy groups. Are there any other kind of groups that you or folks within the industry that you partner with, and what does that partnership look like, and how does it inform the work that you do?
Yeah, so one of the things I didn't talk about was how our study is funded. So UCLA is a research university. I mean, we most of the research we do here is funded through grants that we write. They're either funded by government agencies or by foundations of various sorts. We made a conscious decision when we conceived of this report back in the 2012, 2014, to go directly to the industry for support, with a caveat. Again, we wanted this to be perceived as an objective, reliable report. So we wouldn't go to any one studio and say, here, fund our report, because then there'd be questions of conflict of interest and bias, and maybe you guys are shading numbers for that company since they're funding you and so forth and so on. Instead, what we said was we were going to cap how much money we would take from any given studio or network and try to get as many studios and networks as possible to buy into the study so that it's perceived as an industry-wide study. The other advantage of going to the industry, we found, was that once the industry invests in the report, A, they're likely to read it, and B, they might actually use it to change their behavior. Because at the end of the day, the goal of the report was to affect change, was to kind of, first of all, enlighten executives and other decision makers in the industry as to what the lay of the land was, so they could look at their own practice and see how they related to the bird's eye view, which is what our study presents. So for that reason, we went to the industry. And so just to kind of give you an idea, our latest report, there were 9 or 10 different sponsors: Latino Film Institute, Netflix, Disney, Comcast, Universal, Telemundo, Hulu, Stars, and the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, just to kind of give you a sense. And every year it changes a bit, but we always have 10 or so sponsors who give like at a nominal level so that it's not perceived as a biased report in that respect. And over the years, we've had, HBO, we've had CBS, just a range of different supporters, some of the talent agencies, et cetera. In terms of advocacy groups, we work with any and all advocacy groups, because at the end of the day, our primary goal is just to get the information out.
Yeah.
So we've worked with Color of Change, we've worked with the NAACP, we've worked with the Hispanic National Media Coalition, we've worked with GLAAD, we've worked with any number of organizations that are interested in the representation of their particular group of interest in the industry.
Yeah, great. Is there, I guess, I'm trying to think, I think we can share now some questions that are coming in from the audience, and encourage folks to kind of add those. One question that came in was, what motivates you to keep up this important work?
Yeah, I think, again, I think it's because of the power of media and our tendency to kind of lapse into this false sense of security that it's just entertainment and we're just having a good time, and not realize the ways in which media help us frame the world around us. And in today's society in particular, there's a lot of polarization and, political conflict of various sorts, and groups often think they know about other groups, and attribute, characteristics to them that aren't necessarily true. And a lot of that stuff is born in media. So again, as a sociologist, I understand the power of media. That's what I study as a sociologist, race and media. And so Hollywood is a major player that, in some instances, doesn't really understand its power. And so, we're here as a public institution that does this type of research to arm people in the industry with the data they need to kind of think more critically about what they're doing. Right. And for us, the hook is showing them, and you can do this important work and actually make more money, because it's an industry after all. And so that, in fact, I believe that's probably the single most important reason why our report has become as impactful as it is because we've been able to show the ways in which diversity sells. Yeah. I just realized that I haven't even talked about what we've actually found in the report.
Yeah, I was like, feel free to share more highlights or wins or anything you want to share from the report.
Well, so I guess, I started to say the discourse has shifted in the industry from when we started, when it was just kind of seen as something that, a burden that the industry had to deal with, to something that actually, creates money, creates profits for the industry. And as you might imagine, as that realization came to the fore, there was a lot more emphasis in the industry placed on diversity and inclusion. And so we've seen tremendous increases in on-screen diversity over the period of our report, to the point where the last couple of years, for the first time in history, we have proportionate representation on screen for people of color as a whole. There's some differences among the different groups, like Latinos, for example, continue to be underrepresented compared to their share of the population. But if you put all people of color together as a block, their share of the major roles in TV and film are pretty close to 40%, pretty close to their share of the population. And that had never existed. We didn't even get close to that. When we started, we were down like 10 or 12%, So on screen, I think the biggest takeaways are, on screen, we've seen a lot of progress. for diversity. Now, you can argue about the quality of those images and whether or not they are telling stories that are empowering and uplifting, or whether they're telling stories that are rooted in stereotype. That's a different type of analysis that we don't do. And lots of people do that analysis. But I guess the other side of the coin is that we haven't found as much progress behind the camera. And that's concerning and continues to be a concern because, as we mentioned earlier, that's where the stories are told. That's how they're told. That's where they're written. That's where decisions are made about what story is going to be told and how much the budget's going to be, who's going to direct it, which has an impact on the look and the feel of a project, etc. And there, we're talking about an industry where males are still firmly in charge, particularly in the executive suites. And most of those males happen to be white. And we don't have the type of diversity yet in the executive suite that I think would allow the industry to really move to the next level and produce projects on a routine basis that are more in sync with where the audience is. And so that's kind of the argument we made. And again, we have lots and lots of data that kind of support that point in terms of what audiences are watching and why they watch it. We have, I didn't mention this, but in addition to the databases we use to kind of count people and, to look at their characteristics and to track that over time, we also have a contract with Nielsen, who does ratings for TV, so we can, know for every single project that we have in our database what the audience reception was. And we also have demographic data for the audience. We know the race of household, for example. We know, and that's part of our analysis. We also have data on who buys movie tickets. There's surveys done of people when they leave the theater, and they collect demographic information as well. So we know, for example, that the last few years, if you look at the top 10 films in America, opening weekend in terms of box office, people of color bought the majority of the tickets for like 7 or 8 of those films, which again is, highly consequential in terms of the bottom line for the industry, which again will shape the way they're thinking about the casts in their films now because they know who's watching.
Yeah. In that regard, there, I have some numbers, and I think it relates to what you just shared. So it says that 8 of the top 10 theatrically released films in 2021 featured casts that were greater than 30% minority, and that the first time researchers began tracking, the majority of Oscar-winning films from 2020 were helmed by directors of color and featured minority leads. What do you think led to this increase?
Well, let me unpack 2 different things. I mean, I think the first statistic you shared has been sort of growing for a long time. That's to say, films have been getting more and more diverse on screen, and we've been documenting this for a number of years. But I think the fact that for the first time we had the majority of the top films directed by people of color, or the Oscar winners rather, that was a first, largely because of, I think, coming out of the Floyd, killing a couple of years ago. I know there was a huge emphasis in the industry placed on doing better with respect to the types of representations the industry produces. That sometimes increases the likelihood that certain types of projects are going to be greenlighted and produced that may not have been produced before. Maybe they are given a better budget and a better marketing sort of budget, which tends to increase the likelihood that the film is successful. So I think a number of things coming together. I think the pandemic and we talked a lot in our last report about the impact that the pandemic has had on top Hollywood films. The fact that in 2020, the first year of the pandemic, more than half of all Hollywood films, the major films, were released via streaming platforms because theaters were closed. And what that did was create an opportunity for smaller films that probably wouldn't have had the type of box office release prior to the pandemic to gain the attention of audiences who were stuck at home. And guess what? A lot of those audiences were people of color. And those films became very popular, did really well in terms of ratings. And that kind of showed Hollywood what was possible if you produce more projects like this and give them bigger budgets. So I think all of those factors together kind of created this perfect storm that led to some of the pretty sizable leaps forward that we saw in the last year or so with respect to some of those statistics you just read.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that so much because I imagine in most of the folks who are on the call, in all of our industries, they've been impacted by, the racial reckoning or the murder of George Floyd and the pandemic. So I really appreciate hearing how it impacted this specifically. Is there anything additional that you want to share that like we haven't asked about yet?
Maybe I can talk a little bit about how I personally came to this.
I would
Why?
love that.
Yeah. So I actually, I'm from the East Coast originally, and part of my ulterior motive for moving west was I thought I wanted to be a filmmaker,
Okay.
and I came out here, and I probably shouldn't mention this on a UCLA alumni town hall, but I started my academic career as an undergraduate at that place across town that we won't name.
I also got I also have a degree from there, so.
So anyway, so what I told my parents, of course, was that I was going to major in architecture or some other, legitimate, major. But what I really wanted to do was major in film, because no one where I was from knows what majoring in film is all about. I'm from the Washington, D.C. area. And so, but that's what I figured, I imagine I'd major in architecture and I would kind of double major in film or something. Well, it doesn't quite work that way. I discovered as I got here. I eventually did get into the film school there and found that I was one of like maybe 3 or 4 African Americans in the whole program, which was really shocking to me. I didn't expect that. It was kind of an alienating experience. But I got to the program. I ended up double majoring in journalism. I got my degree in journalism before I completed my film degree, and actually took a job working in public relations with my journalism degree. And again, I found myself in spaces where there wasn't a lot of diversity, and they were spaces where narratives and stories were being told about things that, from my point of view, I may have told differently, given my background and experience. So that got me thinking about, like, what is the impact of this whole diversity, lack of diversity thing? Mm-hmm. So I ended up applying to business school. Everyone told me, oh, get an MBA. That's what you have to do to kind of move your career ahead at that point in time. I won't tell you when, because I don't want to date myself. But as luck would have it, NBC had this management training program for to try to encourage minorities to kind of go into management in television. And the deal was, if you got admitted to a business school in one of the cities where NBC had an owned and operated television station, you were eligible to apply for the fellowship. You had to do an interview, and then either you got it or you didn't. So as it turns out, I interviewed, and I ended up being the fellow for the NBC management program, which they call, I believe, the Management Associates program in Washington, D.C., my hometown. So I got to go back home. And the NBC owned and operated station in Washington is WRC-TV. So, of course, given my background in journalism, what I really wanted to do as a management associate, which was like a year-long training program. And then, after I got my MBA, it was a year-long training program. I went to Georgetown for my MBA, which was the school that was designated for that program. I think in New York, it was Columbia. Here in LA, it was UCLA, actually. And Chicago, I think it was University of Chicago, and so forth. So after I did my MBA, I went to work at NBC in the management program. And after you graduate from that program, they would, put you in a permanent position. But the management program was rotating through the entire station, getting a feel for the entire business. I worked in advertising and sales. I started out in the business office. After all, I was an MBA, so I had to do business stuff, and, business planning and that type of thing. I worked in the promotions department, where they do like the lead-ins to the news shows. And last but not least, I worked in the newsroom, which is where I really wanted to work because my background was in journalism. Right. Again, I was shocked in the newsroom that there was almost no diversity other than me and like maybe 1 or 2 other people, And I remember going to news meetings in the morning where we read the Washington Post and look at the news of the day and decide, how we were going to assign the news crews to cover news for our 5 and 7 o'clock news shows and that type of thing. And, and it was clear to me that the news was being framed in ways, again, that didn't take into account the experiences of groups who were absent in the meeting. And I felt, my own just personal impression was that something's missing here. So I did some reading, and all the reading I did, in my spare time that was interesting about that phenomenon was written by sociologists.
Yeah.
So I said, maybe I'm really a sociologist. Maybe I need to. So I applied to PhD programs rather than take a job at NBC.
Yeah.
And that's how I ended up at UCLA. I came to UCLA, I visited, really came down to UCLA and Berkeley. And I came to UCLA and I was really impressed with the faculty in sociology. And they convinced me that what I was interested in could be studied at UCLA. And of course, UCLA had the advantage that Hollywood was here,
Right.
So from the very beginning, I knew I wanted to study race and media and kind of the relationship between the two. And that's kind of how I got interested in this question of diversity in Hollywood. While I was working on my dissertation, which happened to be on the 1992 LA uprisings.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it was all about news coverage and the ways in which race impacted the news coverage, as well as the way people were interpreting the news coverage. Mm-hmm. I happened to be at the LA County Human Relations Commission because they had some data I wanted to reference in my study. I happened to be there the same day that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights was here in town because they were visiting in the aftermath of the uprisings to do a study of community tensions that led to the uprisings. And they were looking for an ambassador to take them around LA and to introduce them to the various people and the places they had to go. And they were interested in looking at Hollywood because they hadn't really done a study of Hollywood since I think the late 80s. And they wanted to, look at or study the degree to which Hollywood images, as I had implied before, could have potentially led to some of the tensions that resulted in 1992 uprising. So the person at the commission said, hey, we have this PhD student from UCLA, he's here, maybe you should talk to him. Long story short, I ended up becoming a staffer for the US Commission on Civil Rights. And I spent like a year going to every major studio, every network, every advocacy group, the employment guilds, and making those contacts. And that ultimately led to kind of my interest in this particular topic. And I've kind of pursued it ever since.
I am so appreciative of you sharing your story and kind of seeing how the different pathways led you and exploring and really investigating kind of where your interests took you and actually to drive change and then ending up in academia to make this kind of impact through the report. That's really meaningful. I know there's a lot of alums who are also, grappling with their careers and where they want to make a difference in the world. So I really appreciate you sharing all of that. We did have a couple more questions come in from our community. So the next question would be, how would you say that Hollywood is addressing the public health outcomes, especially in regards to people of color?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are any number of advocacy groups focused on this question specifically. So we have I'm trying to remember the name of the group now. There's actually a group at UCLA that's in public health. Okay. And what they do and what they focus on is helping Hollywood storytellers do a better job of telling stories as it relates to public health. And so they will literally review scripts and give them advice about, oh yeah, if this is what you're trying to do, you should focus on this issue or bring this topic up and that type of thing. And so there are other groups like that that have focused on health disparities along gender lines, race, ethnic lines, social economic lines, et cetera. So, I mean, I don't know if I had to grade the industry, what grade I would give them. I mean, I think they do a better job today than they used to, but there's still a lot of work to be done on that front. But know that there are groups out there actively focused on that. Over the years, I've done a lot of consulting for the industry. I've worked with DreamWorks, I've worked with MTV, Nickelodeon. There's a huge industry related to children's programming because obviously, media impact adults. They're even more impactful on children. So there's a lot of scrutiny in terms of programming for children. And so almost every major television show related to children, they hire consultants, educational consultants to kind of help them think through the characters and character development so that kids aren't being sent the wrong messages. And so I've done a lot of that work over the years. And recently, most of my work is focused on sort of, equity, diversity, and inclusion imagery and issues related to TV shows and movies.
Wow, that's such important work when you talk about, the images and what our kids are consuming at that developmental age. So that sounds like such important work. The next question we have, it says, is the paid salaries of actors or directors public knowledge? Is there a way to find out or compare and include this information in future reports?
Yes and no. So one of the things I've done over the years is I've worked with the Writers Guild of America, which is the employment, the union that represents Hollywood writers. And as a condition of your membership in the guild, you pay dues, and your dues are based on how much money you make. So they collect data on the income of their writers. And so what they commissioned me to do, I did this for about 10 years with them, was produce a report they called the Hollywood Writers Report that looks at earnings disparities between women, people of color, and white male writers, because they know that in the industry, white men are kind of the dominant group. And the question is, to what degree do other groups have a fair shake and a chance to kind of A, get a job, and B, get paid comparably, you know? And so, so in that sense, they do have data that is publicly available. You can go to their website. I think it's just wga.org. And you can look at their old Hollywood Writers Reports. One of the problems with the data is not, it's relative data. That is to say, based on your income, you're in different brackets in terms of how much you have to pay in dues. So they have to estimate their earnings. They don't have the exact dollar amount, but there's enough information in there that you can see the differences between, you know, different types of people and what they've earned over time, and they have trend data as well. I don't think the Screen Actors Guild does anything like that actually gets into pay for actors. So I don't know if there's a comprehensive, publicly available source of data for that. The same is true with the Directors Guild. They do studies of directors and who directs shows, but I don't know that they have done an analysis of how much they're getting paid and whether or not there are disparities in pay there. So I think the Writers Guild is the only kind of reliable, relatively regular source of data on pay, and that's focused almost exclusively on writers in television and film. So the answer is, I think it's more anecdotal and hit and miss. I don't know that there's a one-stop source of data for that.
Thank you. The next question is, are you finding more industry experts understanding the need to think through the impact of their programming?
Certainly in terms of the bottom line, yeah.
Right.
and of course, that's why we designed our study the way we did, because we knew that that would get their attention.
Right.
But I think now they've made the connection between the bottom line and diversity. I think they're more open to kind of thinking about the other dimensions like equity and inclusion as well. And so I would say, yeah, I think that the conversation has definitely changed. It's not like it was 10 years ago. I think it's definitely more responsive to those types of issues than it was when we started this 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question says, you've seen where we were from the first 2014 survey. Where we are from the 2022 survey. Where do you think we're going is the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think, you know, it's kind of like the pandemic. You know, I don't know that we're ever going to go back to where we were in terms of how people work. I think we're going to have more hybrid type work solutions going forward. This is something that UCLA is grappling with, you know, the future of UCLA and, you know, how our staff work and how many days they come to campus versus work remotely and all those types of things. We're still trying to figure that out. Absolutely. But I think most people agree that it's probably unlikely that we're going to just go back to 2019 like nothing ever happened. It probably won't happen. And so I think the same is true for Hollywood. The future of movie theaters is kind of questionable. Again, I think Hollywood in recent years has been sort of moving towards, you know, making these huge blockbuster films, you know, all the Marvel and DC comic, you know, franchise films with huge budgets and other big action films. And then everything else is small and, you know, maybe a one-off type of thing. And so I think, you know, we're going to see a lot more streaming. I think streaming is here to stay. I think we're going to see more of that, which may create opportunities for, you know, directors and lesser known actors to kind of get a shot at making something.
Yeah.
Certainly in TV, we've seen that. Streaming and TV has been revolutionary. I mean, TV is unlike anything we've ever seen before. This is probably the renaissance of TV. Yeah. Despite the fact that, Netflix and some of the other streamers have been, downsizing a bit recently, because I think that they kind of developed in terms of their programming. I mean, there's more TV than you can watch. I study TV and I can't watch everything.
Right.
So I think that there's a glut of TV right now. I think we're probably going to see a winnowing of that a little bit. But nonetheless, because of the need to fill all that space, it's created opportunities for first-time directors, first-time writers and producers to create shows that would never have been produced if it was just ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, and a few, HBO showtimes. But now we have all these streaming services. In the streaming services, they don't really care about ratings. For them, it's really more about subscribers and how many subscribers they have. And to, sell to subscribers around the globe, and they do sell globally, they want to have the broadest portfolio they can have, because, once you pay your subscription, you have to get access to everything.
Right.
So that's created a whole new dynamic and kind of a space for them to create shows that, again, seem very esoteric. And why would anybody want to watch that? Because they're trying to create this huge, they're trying to appeal to everyone, as many subscribers as possible. So that's created, again, a move towards diversity we never saw before. So I think that will continue, assuming no major technological shift like streaming, comes next that changes that whole dynamic. But at least for the foreseeable future, I think that's going to be a part of what we see in Hollywood. So I expect on camera for us to continue to see a lot of diversity.
Yeah.
Behind the camera is the big question mark, because we haven't seen as much progress there. And I think for the industry to sustain itself and to continue to give the audience what it's demanding, it's going to have to diversify. And the only question is, when will that happen? How will it happen? And what will that mean for, I guess, the ecosystem of different entities? I mean, everyone's buying up everyone else, so who's going to be left standing? I mean, those are the real question marks, I think, and I think time will tell. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I thank you so much for sharing that. I think like that impact of technology and how that shifts things for us and what that can look like. I appreciate that so much. We only have a few minutes left. I had one question for you, given all of our that we've been talking about, which is there any film or TV show that has impacted you when you were younger, or one that you're watching now that you want to share?
Wow, gosh, I mean,
I know I put you on the spot.
I mean, there's just so much on right now. Gosh, what am I watching? I've gotten into this bad habit of starting to watch a series and streaming, and then I kind of like it, and I move on to something else, and I forget about it. I go, oh, that's right, I was watching this, because I'm trying to sample everything. Yeah. But I think, gosh, when I was younger, well, I mean, when I was really young, I mean, reruns of Star Trek. I'm a Trekkie. I love Star Trek. I love science fiction. So the whole Star Trek franchise, I think I've seen them all, and I've watched them over time. Yeah. Movies, I remember Star Wars. The original Star Wars for me was just like, I had never seen anything like that before, and it just created this whole different outlook in terms of what film could be for me. And so I really enjoyed that. So that was one of my earliest memories of being just really impacted by film. As I got older and became more of a sociologist, a TV show like The Wire was just phenomenal. I mean, I still think it's one of the best things that's ever been made on TV in terms of the sociological insights that the show provides. And it was also entertaining, in a very interesting way. I'm not typically a person who likes crime procedurals. I guess it's not really a procedural, but this was different because it was a lot more sociological in terms of how they dealt with those issues. And so I really enjoyed that. Now, gosh, I'm just watching, I mean, what am I watching now? There's just so much on.
That availability of streaming, right?
I mean, Squid Game last year, again, this show that would never have made it on TV were it not for streaming, certainly not in the US, on Netflix. Was this phenomenon that just really caught on, and I didn't think I would like it, but as I watched it, it was just very interesting to me, so I don't know. I think my tastes are very eclectic, and because I study TV, I kind of want to sample as much as I can, but even then, I can't keep up with everything. So yeah.
I love it so much. Thank you so much for sharing that. In our last few minutes, anything else you would like to add or share as we close up?
Um, I guess I think no, I think we covered most of what I wanted to say. I think it's you know, it's work that I think going forward we're excited to get students involved. And I think I didn't really talk a lot about the students, but the students are just absolutely essential, and they make the show go. I mean, they do all the heavy lifting. We train them. We have like a boot camp where we train them every year. They're working in the summer. When they work for us, we pay their fees and tuition, and they get a stipend. So it's a great opportunity for them. Again, the funding comes from the studios and networks that support this. We also got funding from the state legislature last year, and we're actually in the budget for this year too. We're waiting to see when the budget's finalized. So the legislature has kind of noticed our study, and they want to support it. So we're really excited about that. And again, most of the budget goes to support students. And you know, I do my co-author and I, we do the analysis and the writing, but the students do most of the coding, and we train them on that.
What a wonderful opportunity for students at UCLA. That's so great to hear. I just want to thank you again so much for sharing your pathway or the important work that you do, the way you involve students, the way that how important this work is in shaping our society. And so thank you so much for joining us tonight. I also want to thank our sustaining donors for helping support programs and events like our town hall. We hope that everyone on the call has enjoyed this evening, and we look forward to having you next time. And of course, go Bruins.
All right, go Bruins. Take care.